Again, now we're talking about this body of information that we pick up throughout our lives, but above all during our early years. And what we're doing is simply looking at it from various angles before we enter into it and discuss any of the particular details about it to understand some of the general characteristics of this body of learning. Now, what I am saying is that it is beyond doubt, in my opinion, that every single one of us is picking up that body of information in the first years of our lives by every detail, by every action that happens to us in all those years. Now, the first point, which I alluded to in my previous talk, was that it remains out of sight. It is unconscious. But it is also important to remember that while it is unconscious and out of sight, it is in every sense determining how we act and how we feel about ourselves every single day of our lives. So, do you see the kind of paradoxical kind of insight into this that I'm suggesting? That it is out of sight and unconscious, and we are not aware of its being there. And at the same time, it is so influential that it is influencing every single thing we say or do, or don't say or don't do every day of our lives. Now, my way of referring to this body of knowledge, just because I need a handle, I call it basic training. And obviously, I'm making a metaphor there. Some of you may know that when men or women are inducted into the armed forces, that the first thing that they're subjected to when they go to is basic training. And what basic training does is it habituates the new soldiers to the experience of what's apt to happen to them in combat. And what's important about that training is that the education, that the learning, the experience becomes automatic in the soldier's experience. My favorite example for that is that a man who's 50 years old and many years beyond the basic training will hear a taxi backfire and he'll hit the dirt because he knows in his body, in his experience, what that noise means and will continue to interpret it in that fashion throughout his life. And that's essentially what I call this body of learning that you and I invariably have. I call it basic training. In other words, what the education we get does for us is it trains us to feel with whatever experience we are presently having. That's having that influence. It is enacting itself within us, and we almost certainly are not aware that we are doing that. So when we come later to talk about individual details of how this basic training operates, as we are eventually going to do, I'm going to make some suggestions about specific contents of the basic training. The thing to remember is this general idea that this basic training defines our reactions every day of our lives for everything that we say and do or don't say or don't do. Now, what I'm saying about that is that you and I, as creatures, and that's why I think the multidimensional aspect of the learning is so important here, will feel the presence of that experience whether we know it or not. And we will react to that experience whether we know it or not. And so if somebody is acting in a certain way, if someone is speaking in a certain way, if someone is taking a certain action of a certain sort, even if the specific details of that individual as he or she does or says what they're doing is very different from the original individual from whom we experienced this, with whom we picked up this information, nonetheless, we will feel, we will sense the presence of that similar experience in our lives. And you can see that happening exactly when something is said to an individual and automatically react in a certain way. He or she will know that what is being said, what is being done, has a certain meaning to him, and will react with that meaning in his experience, in her experience, without the slightest idea that that's all automatic and is going on from something that he or she experienced maybe 30 years before, or in childhood, or when he was a small infant, didn't have any sense of giving this an explicit definition. An individual that I know who was routinely hit and spanked when he was a kid told me that he was attending a workshop several years ago, and he was just sitting on took place in the country. He was sitting on a log, more or less looking to his left, talking to someone that he was friendly with there, and that someone standing to his right happened to move his hand in a very vigorous way, just on the periphery of his eyesight, and he had jumped, all right, as though he was going to be hit again, as was when he was a kid. Now, the individual who moved his hand in that fashion just happened to be within the line of sight and had no intention of even moving in the direction of the person who told me this story. But the reality was that that's the way he felt it. It was going to happen again, because after all, when hands moved like that in his vicinity, within the scope of his eyesight, that's what it would mean. And there you have, you see, the kind of automatic presence in experience that this basic training has. In other words, what I'm pointing to is the fact that when an individual comes forward and feels that he or she is troubled, that something in his or her life is not working as she desires it to, when this person feels as though he or she should become a patient, seek therapy, look for some kind of advice, you see, it's important to understand that something in the being, in the body of this person, is operating to bring that situation about. So that if the treatment, if the kind of guidance that this individual seeks doesn't contain that honoring, that bringing into focus the individuality, the basic training, the feeling about oneself that this person has, that the treatment itself is going to be at best very superficial and is not apt to be very effective. Now, that's one of the reasons that I want to focus so much upon this, because and you may remember that I refer to these talks as Learning Life Effective Talk Therapy. And I call it that because I'm perfectly willing to acknowledge that a great deal of talk therapy is not effective. And the reason it is not effective is because the therapy, no matter how well-intentioned, no matter how extensive, if it does not embrace, accept, work with, recognize this aspect of ourselves, that it's a kind of superficial conversation that doesn't even begin to address what the roots of the problem that the person is trying to deal with really are. So the importance of talking about basic training and what constitutes basic training is that we will enact that, we will carry that out in our lives. And if the conversation, the therapeutic work doesn't start out with a kind of real entry into that experience, then it will not be effective. Now, let me add an additional comment. I'll come back to this topic later on in our conversations, but one of the most important aspects of doing this, I've already alluded to when I call it the feeling of being gotten. In other words, one of the painful experiences that makes the basic training negative, hostile, and difficult is the fact that as a child, and for the rest of our lives as individuals, we do not feel gotten. We do not feel appreciated for who we really are. If we're not understood for what we really intend, for what we're really doing, what our real feeling is, we will not feel gotten. And that experience of being understood, of being taken in, of being warmly enveloped by the person who's working with us is painful. It's part of what misinstructs us, gives us bad instruction in our basic training. It becomes painful, you see. So obviously then, for therapy, for talk therapy to be effective, it's going to have to involve this experience, and it often does not. In other words, if the therapist is simply applying a clinical body of learning, if he or she has gone and gotten elaborate information or instruction about the problems of the psyche and all that stuff, and is simply sitting there applying a formula to this individual, then it's going to come across to that individual as unsympathetic, as ungetting as the original painful thing was. So, what is deeply implied for talk therapy to be effective, if we're looking at it from the point of view of this basic training, is that the therapist is obliged, must, if he wants to be, he or she wants to be an effective therapist, is to go into his own, her own basic training to understand what his or her own feelings really are about anything. And he may not get the whole story in one fell swoop, but I think the effective stance here is that he or she will always be learning from the clients what exactly the content is. If there's some aspect that he or she has never thought of before, then let the client teach. That's what a good therapist is doing, always learning about this content of this basic training. Now, I suggest that that's important because if that is known within the therapist, then he or she will reach over with that experience for whatever the client is presenting, is doing. In other words, this is often referred to as empathy, see, but I don't think it's well understood or enough of it said. In other words, I believe that real empathy is when I have no experience of feeling within myself, and with appropriate words and in an appropriate way, and that's a key phrase, appropriate. What's appropriate? We'll talk about that later. But appropriately reach over and let the client know that I understand what he or she is feeling. Nothing is more pleasing to me than when a client of mine will say, wow, I would have used those very words for it. Wow, that's just the way I would have said it. Wow, that's just the way it feels to me. You see, when that individual is experiencing himself, herself, in the reality of what he or she feels, then that can be understood as a kind of welcoming. The getting is a welcoming of that person to come forward with whatever is inside of him or her as a result of their experience. And that welcoming, that sense of being welcomed, I would suggest is absolutely fundamental to any kind of good therapy, because if I am welcome, then whatever it is that's troubling me, whatever it is that's bothering me from my content of my basic training, I can bring forward, I can work with it, and I can learn something new. For indeed, as a creature, I never stop learning. And that phrase, in my view, is the key to therapies working effectively. What have I, as an individual, as being myself, got to learn here? What can I benefit from? And when I talk about effective talk therapy, I think that's really the key center of what the experience wants to be.